Hi there, and welcome to the latest edition of the MiMentor Coaches Coffee Club. We've got a very special guest with us here today, James Clarke-Reed. He's a football performance data and technology expert. He's worked at a number of clubs up and down the country and now also works with an organisation called Keyframe Sport. So, James, welcome to the Coffee Club. Can you just give us a little explanation about your role and who you are?
So I started out in the world of football at Southampton Academy in the community programme, and then went on to work in the world of performance analysis at Brighton, Hove, Albion. And I was at Brighton, Hove, Albion for around about 5 years, 3 different managers involved in the performance analysis process within the first team across pre and post match. Somewhat to do with the academy initially when we started that as well, a little bit in recruitment too, but mainly working with the first team coaches. Gustavo Boyet is the sort of the longest serving coach that I work with. Since then, I've left the world of analysis from a club side and now work as a technology consultant and advisor for teams and businesses working in the space across video and data and how that impacts players and coaches alike.
To you, what does observation when it comes to sport and particularly to football, what does it mean?
So observation to me in football is something that covers many different areas, of course, through training and in-game. And if you think about the in-game scenario and the level of an emotional intensity in that observation, it's very difficult to take everything on board that you may see. Research actually says that coaches only recall around about 30% of information from a performance. So, take into consideration the emotional impact, as well as the capacity of the human brain to do that. Observation is something that by one person is fairly tricky to do, right? So you can see coaching staffs today scale out the number of people they have and then break down the elements that they need to observe, such as a set piece coach or a coach that just focuses out of possession and then someone in possession. So it's apparent that observation and being able to do that as a one human brain is very difficult. And chunking the game of football up into sections is the way to go. Now that's harder for anyone that doesn't have a coaching staff of 10, 5, 3 even. If you're on your own or you've only got one assistant, what do you look at? So being aware of your limitations as a person is the first thing I think that anyone has to take into consideration. And then the possibility of potentially using other people or technology to help you with that process as well. So that's how I would define and sort of encapsulate observation in football in that aspect.
What would you say is the difference between, say, analysis of data and observation of matches?
So I think if you look at observation and recalling information and being able to have that and say we're looking at the breakdown of a goal conceded, pretty apparent what that is. It's a fundamental event in the game. But if you put that into the feedback loop and the coaching process, you've got to observe elements within that event, and then you need to take that and feed that back into the actual process within coaching and the analysis process itself. Now, this is kind of what I was alluding to earlier, where you were talking about technology and how that impacts on that analysis process. We all learn visually, especially research proves that sports athletes and coaches tend to learn visually the most. So using video as part of that analysis process is very, very important. But you often need someone within a technical sense to help with that process, simply because there's not enough time or resources around for you to coach and then break video down, right? So you've kind of got the analysis process is supplemented by video first and foremost if it's recorded. However, it's not just about that, it's about how you deliver that process as well. So what's interesting about observation is bias as well and the analysis process in there. So if you're a set piece coach and you can see the goal, maybe you're not going to necessarily talk about that the set play wasn't correctly established and set up, and your bias is going to have an impact on that. So you need to be aware of how that impacts on your analysis process and how that actually then is fed back into the player or the athlete, simply because maybe you don't want to being wrong, or maybe you don't want to, be punished, whatever that is for that mistake as such. So I think a good way of adding a sort of an extra layer onto that is looking at data in particular, and that's definitely becoming more available in the sort of lower levels within football. But I think in the elite space, it's something that is often used to give a little bit more context, to be a bit more objective than it being the subjective bias within that process. So being aware of that in observation is critical, but the analysis process in particular, and understanding how that's fed back in using objective and subjective information is important. The final thing I would also say on the analysis process in respect to observation and the link would be the emotional impact that a player or an athlete has post-performance. So being able to go back and look at a situation, positive or negative, and relay that information back to the player or the athlete, not instantly after the game, is a very common way, and a very popular method, simply because the player may not be able to contextualize and understand and emotionally actually digest that information afterwards. So the analysis process needs to be not only not biased, it also needs to be clear and concise with as much resource as possible to deliver, but equally it needs to take into consideration the player and when is best to deliver that analysis. You often hear of coaches not letting players look at video instantly after the game, or even on the bus on the way home at the higher levels, because it's too much emotion involved. So you just have to be aware of how that information and analysis is going to be digested.
So in terms of observation, analysis of games, it's something that happens quite a lot at grassroots level. We're seeing a lot more these days. What would you say are the sort of common mistakes that some coaches might make these days when it comes to observing matches?
So common mistakes, and look, we're all guilty of this. Even your top coaches in the world today, and that's ball watching. Right? There's two sides to the game. It's very difficult with football and the number of players, whether it be small-sided or 11v11, in that there's lots of different things to look at. So the observational aspect of watching the ball too much and not watching the wider picture is a sort of quite a common area and mistake that people often have within observation, within watching the game and doing that. Of course, you've got the bias element as well, and maybe you're sort of seeing things the way you want to see them, and there's been interactions in the past with a certain player, and maybe a situation happens and that is having an impact on your observation as well. A second opinion is always a powerful thing, just to validate that observation. And I think then being able to sort of take that and being able to sort of articulate that back is a challenge in itself as well. How do you take that observation live, if you are providing that feedback live, and deliver that, and what's the kind of narrative that you do that? Is it positive, is it negative, and how you put that into the observation? So I think being able to sort of use video post-match away from a live situation is a great way of checking and seeing what you've done, and seeing how you've recalled that information and reserved it. And I would say they're the biggest sort of pitfalls as such, where people are often not focusing on the wider elements of the game, or perhaps being a little bit biased around what they're seeing. And then also sharing that with other. I suppose if you look at it like this, right, it's kind of like, if I see something, I feel strongly about it, and I share it with you, you're going to have an impact from me, right? So when you see something, if I've given you that agenda, then it's very difficult. So trying to keep it clear and concise around how you're seeing things independently often is a better way of observing things as a group, instead of it just being one individual impacting another.
And is there anything particular that coaches can improve on, and any tips or advice you might be able to give coaches to help them become better at observing and analysing their team?
So I would say chunking the game down into sections within the video and being able to sort of have a look at various parts of the game, right? So as coaches or scouts or anyone involved in that observation process, there's a lot of information to take on board, right? It's very difficult for one person, even a group of people, to get organized. So if you're using video and you're being able to chunk that game down into just set plays or just final third entries or just the goals conceded across the whole season, being able to sort of bring all of that together using video to then observe from that is naturally going to help you come to a conclusion which has much more evidence and is not just you watching every game or individually watching all the games in a row. So you've kind of got those parts there in terms of how you're reviewing and breaking it down. I think it's a really important factor to use video and to chunk the game down into sections. I think the other part to that is that every coach has got an ideology, philosophy, how they want to play. It's the beauty of the game, right? So if you can then combine that with how you're going to break the game down and observe the game that way, then maybe a good example would be for me as an analyst. I wanted to break the game down into how we would build out at a very particular style of play at Brighton. I would say we were the first coaching staff to actually implement a possession-based style at Brighton. So how we played with our holding midfielder and our fullbacks was quite distinct at the time in the Championship. And being able to understand that, and then for me to be able to look at every time that we built out, break that video down, it was easier for me to observe, but easier for the coaches to also observe from that video. So I think that's a good example of a way that is quite commonly done now in performance analysis. And within coaches themselves to break the game down and then share those chunks of video back into the analysis process.
So nowadays, is there any difference in the way that, particularly with young players, that you can actually pass on the information that you gather? Is there any sort of engaging ways? We used to watch Match of the Day and things like that and watch games, but do children still, or young players, do they still watch the games like we might have when we were younger and analyze other players' performances? And how could you sort of use technology these days to share the information with the players?
I think any coach that observes an event, however they review and kind of bring that event back to life, has an issue in themselves to be able to analyze that correctly. But then, and the really challenging part this currently at the moment is to be able to then provide that in a way that actually sinks in. So if you think about many of the younger players and athletes that are being coached today, they come from a world of short form content, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube Shorts. So they're not watching as much football as older generations did, full games. So being able to make sure that from what you did observe to then how you analyze that and how you shared that is absolutely critical. You get that one moment done in a way which actually sinks in. So it's becoming harder and harder to actually interact with your player. And that's why telestration is a really, really important aspect within that process. Simply put, it increases the attention to a particular area, which amplifies the message that you are displaying as a coach. So within your analysis process, if you're working with Generation Z or Generation Alpha athletes, players, you really have to be using a tool such as telestration to be able to really get that message over, simply because their attention span is shorter and shorter each year, just by the nature of the world we live in. But it's a challenge in itself to be able to do that on top of observing a game, managing video, producing the analysis, and then coming up with that particular analysis with telestration on top. So I think there's options out there that help coaches with that. It's almost like a funnel process, right? We observe the game, we observe something that is particularly important to us as a coach, We have to then put that through the analysis process and how we bring that to life. And then we have that video, and then we use video as an example. And then from there, what we need to do is make sure when we show that the player actually understands what we're showing. If you're going to break down a phase of play, now the player could be looking at a completely different area than you think they are looking at. How can you make sure they understand that without having to ask them questions, without having to watch them, without having to combine both those things and then see that implemented in their performance when you coach them again or when they play? Telestration solves all of those problems because it's very evident exactly to your coaching point within the video what you should be doing, what you're showing rather, and it's a very clear map for them to follow. And it's a proven way of coaching younger athletes and players. So yeah, I think that's integral to modern day coaching, regardless of level, whether you're at the top or you're striving to be at the top, you know, or you're a grassroots coach doing it for the love of the game. Telestration should be something that is undoubtedly used within your armory to coach the players.
So we touched on earlier that you are involved with Keyframe Sport. And so explain to us a little bit about Keyframe and how that would fit into the sort of overall picture when it comes to observing or particularly match analysis.
Yeah, so Keyframe's different to any other tools and software on the market that helps within the telestration process, simply because it's built to be easy to learn, quick to use, and really good value for how much the user pays, quite frankly. Simply, it's a tool that you don't have to spend a long time creating analysis to share that with your players, because coaches and anyone that's using technology today is often having to spend too long to actually get the end product, and they don't have that time. You know, you've got to set the game up, you've got to coach, you've got to get all the other stuff involved, ticked off, that you're having to do within your club or your college or whatever environment you're working in, but you're missing out on that technology piece. And Keyframe is built to be super user friendly and is very unique in that way. We have lots of different users who come from many different generations and walks of life that are using the software because they don't have to be a technology expert. What they are is a coach first and foremost, and the software allows you to capture your voice and the way you see the game and what you observe within your coaching points, then capture that very quickly in one go and share that instantly. And we're not connected to any particular way of sharing or capturing. However you collect video, if you have video, you can use Keyframe to use telestration to make your players better, ultimately win more games. So it's a unique offering for as many coaches from as many different walks of life and places, generations and skill sets as possible. And that's why it's unique.
Yeah, and we probably see a lot these days, coaches, you see it a lot of grassroots football games, coaches and teams will have the cameras, they'll have all the technology around to try and capture footage. But sort of what's the next step? How important is it to know what to do once you have picked up this data, picked up this footage? How important is it to sort of go the next step and understand how to make the most of that?
It's time as well, right? A lot of, you know, if you're an elite level coach and you're fortunate enough to have a coaching staff, one of the skills you have to have is how you set your coaching staff up, what they need to do. Someone will be responsible for that process of observing the game and breaking it down so others can observe it easier and with less risk and less error. Right? So when you're a coach that doesn't have the ability to deploy a staff across different areas, you've got to be a jack of all trades, but really you've got to be a master of all trades, because otherwise you're not going to be successful. So you have to do it all and do it well. So relying on technology that helps you do that kind of alleviates that time pressure and the knowledge that you might not have to get the best out of software, whatever software that is critical. It's down to softwares to be able to to be built in a way which actually allows you as a coach to be that master of all trades. And I think that I think the technology is as important, if not more important, for coaches that aren't as fortunate as Jurgen Klopp and Pep Guardiola and whoever else that have enormous staffs that are like, there to do a number of tasks. It's a challenge in itself, right? But technology can help, and video is one thing, but what you do with that video and how you provide that to have the most impact with your players is the most important thing, because otherwise it's just filming the game for filming the game's sake. And it's great to observe it. What are you doing with it? I think that's really important.
Thanks very much for that, James. It's been an absolutely enlightening session with you today. Obviously, this all sort of fits into our recent course on the MiMentor platform called The Art of Observation, which helps coaches get their first sort of taste of observation and understanding how to analyse matches, how to analyse performance, and use that information to improve their teams and improve their players. So, yeah, once again, thanks very much for that, and we hope to see you soon.